The reason I call my talks Knowing What You Believe is so often we're able to talk about our relationship with Christ and how important that is. But when challenged, can we define why what we believe makes a difference of important issues? And tonight we're going to focus on the pro-life movement and the importance, because of what's going on, to not only be able to talk about it from a faith perspective, but also from a logical perspective and from a scientific perspective. It was 40 years ago when my brother's son was born, and I was visiting him, and he had a New Republic magazine, Left of Center magazine. I think it's very important that we all read different perspectives. That helps a lot. And it said these Christians who are against abortion only care about the babies until they're born. And I stopped and I thought, that's a fair critique. It's a blanket statement. It's not totally fair, but it's a fair critique and a fair question to ask. And a fair question to ask Christians, because we're called absolutely to care for the babies, but to care for all of creation. And it made me think about that, and then it made me see, as I look more, when we're looking at something like the Women's Care Medical Center, that's exactly what they do. There's an absolute caring for the baby, but for the mom and for the dad and for afterwards and for connecting churches with people in need. So that's an example of the Christian worldview in action. So we're going to talk about that tonight and get a little in depth, because I think it's important to grasp it at this time, because Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. And so, that's the end of abortion. No, that's the end of what we've been having, if you will, one argument for a generation plus. We're about to have 50 arguments because it's going to go to the states. And we're already seeing what's happened. New York, it was about 2 years ago, they passed one of the most unrestricted, allowing even partial birth abortion. Colorado did that last week with some exceptions, but there are no trimester exceptions. But the flip side is there as well, because you're going to have proposals to charge the mother with murder, and you're going to have proposals that make absolutely no exception for the life of the mother, of which there are some pregnancies in which the mother will die. So we're not going to get into all those tonight, but just to say, we're going to have a lot of discussions. When you look at Jessica here, which worldview do you think would most likely lead to life that Jessica had when she grew up? If she believed that humans evolved by chance from the lower forms of life, or if she believes humans were created in the image of a loving and caring God. What worldview that she carried would lead to what decision? And I think it's critical as we look right now to have understanding what the critical Christian worldview is, but also to be able to, as I call it, regaining the intellectual high ground. And if we see that, the issue is because the secular world, of which in America is becoming more secular, we're now up to 1 out of 4 Americans have no religious belief. It was 1 out of 5 before the pandemic, it's 1 out of 4, it's about to be 1 out of 3. So you have a more secular, and it's not only that they don't believe in God, for example. It's the idea that the worldview is reason and faith must be separated. That's fine. You can go to your church, but that's got nothing to do with science and facts and that sort of thing. Of course, the Christian worldview that's nonsense. They're totally together. In the same way, the church has to engage with the critical issue, and again, absolutely go beyond simply the relationship with Christ that I have individually to what that relationship means in the culture, the kingdom of God here on earth. And how does that look, and how does that play off? And it means answering tougher challenges to the idea of faith and what it means in this increasingly secular culture. And so critical is more Christ-like responses. There is no better time for the church to be the church than when it is under the most pressure. And I think one of the big mistakes is if you end up acting like the culture and how you respond to that. I'm reminded, and studying under Chuck Colson, he loved talking about the story of the early church in the first century, and the plagues would come all the time. And the early church, these Christians were going out to strangers who were infected with the plague and ministering to them, sometimes dying. And the people outside were saying, who are these folks who care enough to do that? The church was being the church and being very countercultural. And I think it's critical, and we'll talk about this at the end, how we respond, because sometimes, I love the example, they may not remember what you say, but they'll remember how you said it. And I think it's critical that the church remain that way, in that loving, Christ-like way, because it's going to, you're already seeing it, it's going to be tougher and tougher. Romans 12:2, I think this says it all to set up from a biblical perspective what we're looking at. And don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Jesus was the brightest man on earth. So that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And throughout the Bible, we're called to think things through and to not disengage the mind. But that's the stereotype. And we can't play into that stereotype, which means we have to be able to, if you will, stand toe-to-toe from an intellectual standpoint. Here's something that this came last week, and I gotta say, it's the first time I'd heard of it. It's in Atlantic magazine. And Margaret Atwood said, if you believe in ensoulment, that is, that there is a soul for the unborn baby, at conception you should not get an abortion, because to do so is a sin with your religion. If you do not so believe, you should not, under the Constitution, be bound by the religious beliefs of others, but should, in the Alito opinion, become the newly settled law, the United States looks to be well on the way to establishing a state religion. Massachusetts had an official religion in the 17th century. In adherence, the Puritans hanged the Quakers. This is a different challenge, saying, because you believe that the baby in the mom's womb is a child and should not be aborted, that is a state religion, so therefore I don't have to adhere to it. Okay, how are you going to answer that? It takes some thinking, and we can take all sorts of holes in it, but the point is that it's going to get tougher as we go and we look at the argument. This is a little snarky, but it's one of my favorite. I love Jesus, I just don't like the theology, doctrine, and Bible stuff. It goes to the point of how important it is how we talk about things. This is a quote from a congressman, and his name wasn't given. It was in a book in 2004 called Total Truth for Nancy Pearcey. It's a terrific book about truth in the Christian worldview. He said, I got involved in politics after the abortion decision, Roe v. Wade, because I thought it was the fastest way to moral reform. Well, we've won some legislative victories, talking about restricting abortion. But we've lost the culture. We need to develop a Christian worldview. I think that's the heart of why worldview matters. And just to go through this idea of what it is, it's really the lens through which we look at the world, and the world makes sense to us. And everybody has a world. I've heard some atheists say, I don't have a worldview. Oh, nonsense. You have to have a worldview. You have to, because otherwise you couldn't function. You have to have a way to make sense of things and how you act. And so the simplest way to put it is to think of these four questions. These four main questions will determine in a large way your worldview, but more importantly, as you're talking to somebody, what is their worldview? And the first one is, how did we get here? So in this room, if we took a survey, I would think we'd hit at least 98%. How do we answer? How did we get here? All right. Made in the image of God, in God's image, created in God's image. What would the naturalist, that one who only believes in the senses, the things you can see, feel, hear, or touch, what would their answer be? Evolution became, okay? Scientific, it's just science. All right, so here's an example. I'm going to just use a little example of how the Christian worldview is going to inform your discussion at your Thanksgiving table with your non-believing relatives. So, this is how did we get here? Well, evolution, okay. So, now we're going to talk about science. So, it began when? With the monkeys? Well, no, it began before the monkeys. Okay, it went back to the first cell. Okay, all right. Now we have a starting point. So, how did the first cell start? It's a scientific question, and they got to have an answer. Well, they'll say, well, what do you think? And I'll say, okay, well, let's talk about the Big Bang. And by the way, the Big Bang is on our side. When the Big Bang was discovered, it's almost 100 years old, right at 100 years old. The ones most concerned about the Big Bang were the naturalists. And what that proved was the universe is expanding. And so if it's expanding, you got to go backwards to say it started and then it started at one piece. And the naturalists said, it's much better to say it's always been here, folks. Just the way it's always been. Now, scientifically, we're saying it began. Who's the Big Banger? How did it start? Now, our position is there's God, eternally living, who created it. That's our answer, and we'll have that discussion. Who's your Big Banger? What began it? So you notice that I didn't use what? The Bible. We're talking science here. The other one is how finely tuned. You know, if we're talking just degrees closer to the sun, life would not form. If we were a little bit farther, life would not form. Too hot, too cold. Gravity, if it's a micron off, we're all floating. And if it's a little stronger, we're all crushed. It's called fine tuning. It's at least acknowledged. So what's more likely, the randomness of all this coming together and ta-da, or that there was someone designing it? It's not proof, but you see where I'm doing? We're talking scientifically. So we're on that same line. You're saying faith and reason are separate, and I'm saying no, we're putting the Bible on the shelf for now. All we're doing is talking about science. But we're getting to this point, how do we get here? You know, what's wrong with the world? I used to, Brent mentioned I was in television. I ran a station. That was the last of my jobs. And folks would come in and sell shows. We had Wheel of Fortune, for example. You know, the salespeople would come in. And I loved taking them to lunch and talking about things. And that's where I would start with what's wrong with the world. And because they were all from big cities, there was always crime. Always. And we would get into that discussion. Our view is the sin. It's a fallenness. And theirs that it's economic or it's racial. It's issues that we can't deny, but what's deeper than that? So that gets into what's wrong, and then how do we fix it? And we have an idea of the power of Christ in fixing, and that power of redemption, and that's one of the things about the critical theories, that we're all in boxes based on oppressed or oppressor, and there's no reconciliation and there's no restoration. We believe in restoration. We are sinners. There's someone who died for us. We can be restored. That can fix it. It's not going to be a program or money, or those can help, but it's not going to fix the main thing. And then the final one is, what's my purpose in life? Wow, okay. Is our purpose to glorify God, or is our purpose simply to live and do whatever we want? How do they determine if you have a Christian worldview? You don't say, I'm a Christian, so therefore you have a worldview. When people look, such as George Barna, they ask questions to delve deeply, and these are just a couple of them. Do you believe God is all-knowing, all-powerful, just creator of the universe who still rules the universe today? Yay or nay? You know, how do you check that box? The Bible is the accurate and reliable word of God. Or is it a bunch of stories that this or that? There is such thing as absolute moral truth. Or is everything relative? And that's the modern, postmodern. The Holy Spirit is a living being and not merely a symbol of God's power, presence, or purity. Same question sometimes asked of the devil. Is the devil real or just a symbol of things out of hand? People will go to heaven only because they've confessed their sins and accepted Christ as Savior. Sin is real. Humans are not basically good. You'll be shocked to know that 9% of professed Christians have a Christian worldview. 91% can't answer basic, and these aren't trick questions, these are basic biblical grounding questions, which says we've got an issue. I just wanted to set that tone of Christian worldview because it's really critical how we're thinking about something, and then we look at where abortion is and how we got here. And we look at Genesis 1:28. God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on earth." Having that responsibility, having that life. And you know what came, right? Satan attacking the image bearing of God, what is good. We saw that from the beginning, and we see that today. That's the fight there. Once we get into the late 1800s, after the Enlightenment period of the 18th century, 1700s, into the late 1800s, the deconstruction of our faith began. Happened to be right after Darwin. There's a timing there. It started in Germany. That's where this idea of, well, is the Bible really true and accurate? And that was where the deconstruction began. And that was really opening the door to the individual rules. That set the tone. And you'll hear this name, Margaret Sanger, American Birth Control League. She founded in 1921. And her push was contraception. And her, which was illegal in a lot of places, reproductive rights proponent, a strong proponent of that. But she was also one who believed in eugenics, and that is that you want to breed the right kind of people for the country. Well, we also know who kind of like that idea in Germany. But the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extinction of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization. Not subtle, and something that was papered over, shall we say, until recently, I must say. They've taken her name off. In New York, Planned Parenthood took her name off. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about logic and the worldview and how it works in here. C.S. Lewis, love C.S. Lewis. He says the most dangerous ideas are those assumed and not spelled out. And that's where we are now. You think about things that are assumed. And let's keep focused on abortion. What is assumed? It's my body, my right. They're just cells. It's just, think about assumptions. Think about when you read stories about lots of issues. What's assumed, right? Where you have to stop. Do you ever stop and say, wait a second? And that's where we get to logic. And I just want to do a little explanation when we're looking at evaluating truth claims, because that's what we're talking about. And when we're talking about somebody, about ultimately faith, we're talking about truth. And when we're talking about abortion and what you're talking about aborting, you're talking about truth. And what is it that we're talking about? We're going to play semantics, or we're going to talk about reality. Think about arguments for abortion, okay? And think through this lens of, is it an argument that is evidence and a conclusion? It doesn't mean the argument's correct, but the thinking is laid out that way. So here's an example. All men are human. I am a man, therefore I am a human. Okay, that's it. There is evidence and there's a conclusion. And then you have an assertion, which is simply a statement, Stuart's an idiot. It might be true, but it's simply a statement with no evidence. So now think, as you're thinking through with your Christian worldview head, and what you're believing, and you're looking at those who are pro-abortion, what do you hear a lot of? Do you hear a lot of arguments, or do you hear a lot of assertions? Okay, and you can probably think of an assertion or two, right? My body, my choice. So it's important, I think, when we're talking about and thinking about it, is saying, wait a second, let's get to the idea of having an argument. And by having an argument, meaning let's present evidence, not that we have to throw chairs at each other. And we don't want to do that. Let's look and put this in play when we're looking at a moral argument versus a preference assertion. Okay, so here's a real one. It's wrong to kill an innocent human being. An unborn baby is a human being. Therefore, abortion is wrong. So there's an argument that is built on a premise. Versus, if you don't like abortion, don't have one. Really? That's an argument? If you don't like slavery, don't own a slave? Huh? I mean, it makes as much sense. It's critical, again, our thinking, because we have a Christian worldview, because we believe not just the sanctity of life, but believe that all of us were made in the image of God, is created. that drove us to this argument. All right, now Christian worldview without the Bible, so don't get scared. But the fact is we're in an increasingly secular culture. And I don't know if you've had this example, and I brought it up before, when you're pulling out the Bible and the answer is, I don't believe in the Bible. So what else you got? We've got to have something else. Our hope is that person will eventually believe in the Bible. But Christianity is, and we got enough gray heads in here. Look, a generation ago, the argument was, is Christianity true? That was the discussion. Is the Bible true? Is it all made up stories? Is the Holy Spirit? Those arguments, there was certainly within our culture, Christianity was deep enough into the culture that there was even the acknowledgement of the value of it. It's just that I may not believe, or I may pretend I believe for work, but I don't necessarily think it's true. So let's have that discussion, and there were some effective discussions. But now, it's not only do I think it's not true, it's not good, it's evil. Now, we could go off on a side tangent and say, how did we get there? And there are reasons. We, the evangelical Orthodox, we have earned some of that by how we've acted. We have earned some of that by some support for those who didn't have the Christian activity, but we supported them anyway because we didn't stand up. But that's a whole nother discussion, which will be a fun one. But nonetheless, we are where we are. I had a boss who used to say, it is what it is. What are you going to do about it? We are where we are. Here's that example when we talk about life and argument. So a zygote. You know what a zygote is? It's a one cell formed by a sperm and an egg. So here's our argument. Zygote, it's one cell formed. A human zygote contains all the DNA to become a baby. Do you know that? One cell. It's got DNA's all in there. It doesn't come 8 months later, on a train or something. It's in there. The fertilized egg has it. Therefore, a zygote is a human being with no difference between what you once were, and are today. And therefore, there's no more justification to kill you now than to kill you then. So that's a scientific way to look at it. And Scott Klusendorf, founder of Life Training Institute, laid this out in a webinar I saw. So there's an example of where faith and reason come together, because it's science and it is informed by your Christian worldview, because that's how you believe in it, but it's also scientific. And so then we go to the idea of Christ-like engagement, just how important it is. And our inclination is, when someone challenges on something like pro-life, to just, all right, start shooting away on zygotes and stuff like that. Start asking those questions. When does we acknowledge that you were happy, or when your niece was born, there was a baby. When did it become a baby? And, that's a question to get the person talking about when human life starts. Actively listen. Lots of follow-up questions. This is just so critical. For one thing, people love it. People love answering questions. But also, again, we're trying to find the worldview. We're trying to find an idea of where they are. We're often finding what's wrong, what's hurting. And you get that by asking and by probing and by finding out. I love it. Now you know how to look whether it's an argument or an assertion. So it's fair to say that's an assertion. Give me a little more. Give me a little more argument about that. So, your body, your choice, okay. Your choice for what? Your choice to do what? Well, to have an abortion. What is an abortion? Abortion. What are you aborting? See what I'm saying? And it gets at least the thinking, well, it's just cells. Is it really? So, but what if you waited 5 months? Would it just be cells? Right? So, it's asking, and it's getting those ideas. Greg Koukl, who started Stand to Reason. It's a radio show. It's an apologetics. He's a great author. I love his term. Put a pebble in their shoe. Put a pebble in their shoe. Just when they walk away from your conversation and they see the word zygote again, or they see a sunrise, or they see a little baby or a pregnant woman. There's a little pebble in the shoe, saying, "What is it that they were talking about? What is that?" And that's that goal of engaging and making a difference, and building up, knowing what we believe, and building up and having that opportunity to make a difference. And as Brent brought out, the Women's Care Medical Center is here, and what a joy to be a part of a group, again, that gets that holistic look of how important it is, the whole life. So it means being prepared to engage. It means engaging in Christ-like way and making a difference. And I hope these are some ideas or thoughts that make a difference. Thank you for this opportunity to share. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.